Okay. Hey, Andrea, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. All right. Let's say who we are. Andrea and I have worked together for a long time now in different projects. We co-host a podcast together with another wonderful co-host, Amy, called Magical Mystical Journeys. So I'm Katy. I'm your minister and New Testament scholar and metaphysical engineer, teacher kind of person.
And I'm Andrea St. Amand. So now I'm an evidential psychic medium, and that's how Katy and I normally work together. But I also am a lawyer. I haven't practiced in a long time. I'm not active in the bar, but I am still have my license. But I did practice in big law, meaning a national law firm, for 10 years. I made partner. I did white collar crime, a lot of business litigation. So I'm not a constitutional scholar, but we're going to dip our toe in that. I do have some experience there, and we're going to be talking about what's going on with our with our Supreme Court right now, and the biggest issue facing a lot of people this last week.
Yeah, definitely. And so Andrea and I have just talked separately off air about like how the energy is, how it's affecting us. So we're going to talk with Andrea's calm, cool, legal mind about like what does this actually mean on a legal basis, because she had a couple of posts that I found super, super helpful. And then towards the end, we'll also talk about kind of the energy of the present moment, how to facilitate that energy in your own life, and how to work towards change in in our society. So we're not going to be super we're not going to sort of like come out with political parties here necessarily.
In fact,
we're going to talk about
this conversation this conversation is really about inviting you to see. So the topic we're talking about is Roe v. Wade, but inviting you to see issues and all the issues that are sort of surrounding Roe v. Wade in a lens outside of Democrats versus Republicans. Because whenever we get into this or that, or it's me against them, we can get really disheartened and feel very helpless, feel angry, feel that there's another party out there, or there's another being out there that's going to steal something away from us. And it just brings up a lot of fight and anger, which is very low vibrational. And it's not really a good way to work toward change.
Yeah. And I find too, whatever side I'm on, if I start to feel smug, that's a really low vibration energy too, right? And so like that's actually not
smug.
Oh my, yeah. So if something happens that like within my value system, I feel really smug, that's actually not a great approach either, right? And so like either smug or despair, wherever you find yourself.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So I have to watch that.
That's a painful truth.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Seriously. So Andrea, all week long, I keep on thinking back to when I was a kid. I don't know if this is still out there, the How a Bill Becomes Law.
Yes.
Song, right?
On the Saturday morning cartoons. Yes.
Yeah. And so because I think it was like really well into my adulthood where I was like, oh, the Supreme Court doesn't really make law in the United States.
They're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to, right? So tell us like what the Supreme Court actually does.
Supreme Court should actually, the United States Supreme Court is even more narrow than what other courts do. The United States Supreme Court really should just be deciding if something is constitutional under the United States Constitution or not, period.
Okay. So
is a law
work their way up
in cases work their way up to them through a variety of methods.
Right.
And then the Supreme Court decides what they're going to take each season, so to speak. But they literally are just taking what's in front of them, a set of facts, state law, federal law, and comparing it to the Constitution and seeing if that law is constitutional. And that it's very complex, very abstract and intellectual. But what how Roe came about is this notion of implying certain rights that are not explicitly in the Constitution.
Okay. So let's just say, like, pause right there. What are some other rights that are not in the Constitution that we now kind of take for granted?
Back in the day when the Constitution was written, you could own other people.
Right. Okay.
It's not a right to be free.
It was not a right to be free. It was not a right to own property.
It was certain people could own property.
Right. It wasn't a right for everyone, though.
Correct.
Yeah.
And women didn't have the right to vote, and nobody of color had the right to vote. So there's certain things that we just so take for granted, but our ancestors really had to fight for those rights. And the way they ended up in the Constitution, they're explicitly written in.
Yeah.
So you get legislators, you get the people to elect representatives to vote on making laws and vote on actually amending the Constitution and adding a right into the Constitution that did not exist when it was first written.
So like I think it's the 19th Amendment is women's right to vote.
I think so.
I forget which amendment it is that granted everyone is free.
Yeah.
After the Civil War.
13th,
and so, yeah, 14th. Okay. So those are amendments
13th,
to the Constitution.
Yeah.
With Roe v. Wade, there was never an amendment made that guaranteed
a right to an abortion.
A right to an abortion or or control over a woman's body. Woman's control over her own body. Let me state that very clearly. Yeah.
Right. There was a zone of privacy. What they read into one of the amendments was that there is an implied right of privacy. And there are certain decisions you can make in that implied right of privacy that the government cannot reach into. The government's not allowed to reach in and make laws restricting your right to privacy. Now, privacy rights come up all
the time,
all over the place, particularly now with technology.
Okay.
So, that's how this right got into the Constitution. It's implied. Okay. And since 1973, when Roe was decided, it's been shaky because on really legal grounds, because it's based on something implied. It's almost like a shadow right. Think about it's a shadow right. Mm-hmm.
Well, so this reminds me. So my wonderful spouse is an attorney as well. And he illuminated many years ago for me that the right to interracial marriage, which was state by state for many, many years, was granted because of interstate commerce law.
Correct.
Yep. Right. So it's not, I don't know if that's ever been amended in the Constitution. I doubt it.
That's it's kind of like an equal protection law.
Yeah.
You can't. So there's certain other rights that people are worried that are on the chopping block now, but they might be on stronger legal grounds because of you can't restrict interstate commerce. Now we're getting really heady.
Yeah, here. But I think just kind of there's these different categories, right? So
so many different categories.
There's all these different categories of protection or non-protection. And so what you're saying is that Roe v. Wade has been kind of on shaky ground for the past 50 years.
Yeah, by some. I mean, people can argue it either way,
right?
But yeah, and I think from what let me just tell you, I had one example, one scenario where I, for a moment, had a deep dive into all the legal history and analysis of Roe v. Wade, and I was working with the National Association of Women Lawyers, and anytime an attack on abortion rights would come up, they would write what's called an amicus brief, which is sort of like a side brief. Even if they weren't parties to the lawsuit, they would submit a brief to the court for consideration from the viewpoint of women's rights. So I got to work on one of the briefs and the sort of behind the scenes talking about the briefs. A lot of women had to acknowledge this was not a rock solid legal case. Okay. Roe v. Wade's not just rock solid. It's not just that you have people trying to knock it down or change it. It's really, there is a whole legal scholar system out there who actually would support the results of Roe v. Wade, but think it should be analyzed differently.
So
and maybe I think that's what we're seeing today with the court.
So there's been, so there's a new analysis.
Different analysis.
Of a different
cases, right? So I think the idea today with what we saw is the court did not uphold the result.
Okay.
They could have upheld the result and came at it a different way. They chose not to even do that.
Okay.
So really what they did, they kicked it back to the state. So where we are now is whatever laws are in your state,
right,
they're going to be constitutional.
Okay.
So now it's going to be a real local state by state push, really on the ground to get new rights worded into law.
Okay. And so that's where we're back to this sort of somewhat classic in America, federal law versus state law. In theory, federal should always win, but Roe v. Wade is no longer upheld on a federal level.
Correct. Now it really is going back to the state.
So every state will decide. And we've seen, of course, massive movement on by states
on a local level.
Yeah, about whether they will continue
and
to provide
one thing that's
or not.
Yes. And one thing that's really disheartening, and I just want to I just want to voice this, acknowledge
we're really not legal automatons, y'all. We really are people who have opinions.
Yeah. What is really upsetting is that, at least in South Carolina, so I've lived in South Carolina for 30 years next year. And what you see in our legislature are these real draconian, dramatic, extremist movements. And they've been doing that for a long time on the conservative side. But then what you also see, and this just happened the other day at our state house, you see these protests and you get extremist movements on the other side. And that's kind of all you see in the media.
Right.
You literally see these horror stories on one side and then people who want all, unrestricted access to abortion on the other side. So you're only seeing the two extremes. And most people don't fall in either one of those camps.
Yeah. Most people of us are in the 25-yard lines.
Right. Completely. So don't be disheartened by those images that you see on television or that you see on social media that are just so extreme, or the little sound bites that your governor or your state representative might just throw out there. It might not be how they end up voting or end up actually writing things into law. And that's where we need to be working. We need to be working on that very realistic middle ground.
So so let's maybe talk about the energy of that a little bit and how to be effective agents of change. So I'll be maybe kind of candid that I do want everyone who needs it to have safe legal access to abortion services.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And at the same time, I want reduced numbers so that we're providing options for people so they don't have to make these kind of choichoices.
Right. Which so hand in hand with that goes like effective, affordable contraception.
Yeah. All of the above, better sex education. And also sometimes people, pregnant people require abortion services because there's not a viable pregnancy.
So many reasons.
There's so many different reasons, right? And so this is some of the middle ground that we're talking about. Not necessarily extreme cases, although extreme cases happen. And, that's kind of.
I will tell you something I just learned the other day, and I didn't know this, is that miscarriages are pretty common. I mean, a lot of women have miscarriages.
Like 25% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. Yeah, it's a lot.
And you know what? Miscarriages aren't always complete.
No, they're not.
A woman could die in the process of a miscarriage if she can't get services to help the pregnancy end, which it has to end, but she could die in that process.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different reasons for good access to safe legal care.
Absolutely.
In my opinion, right? In my opinion. Okay. So let's talk about some of the energy then of the moment, because I think you and I are both agreed that like this versus that and looking only at extremes is super not helpful on an energetic level. I mean, I found myself, I could get sucked into the vortex this past week.
Absolutely. A lot of people did. A lot of people could just feel really depressed and helpless.
Yeah. And I want to honor if that's where you are in this process. And also maybe there's some other ways that we can talk about being effective makers of change, of care, of whatever it is that motivates you.
Well, one thing in terms of like looking at a different perspective, I would remind everybody, our society is in a really different place today than it was when Roe versus Wade was decided.
Like way different.
Way different. When Roe v. Wade was decided, it's unbelievable to me that it was decided because my mother back then could not get a car loan by herself. She had a great job, totally secure benefits, the whole 9 yards, and she couldn't sign off on a car loan by herself. She had to have a man sign for her. She couldn't get an apartment. She couldn't get a lease by herself. A single mom or single woman had very few legal rights on basic living that we have today. Gay rights, forget it. You couldn't even like admit you were gay.
Oh, right. I mean,
it wasn't even
like blacked out windows of bars and
totally. So we're in a different spot. And corporations today, big multinational corporations back in the day never would have taken progressive stances in favor of their employees. And now we see big movements in areas outside of legislation where corporations are taking stances to protect their employees. And one of them is making it clear that the health insurance that they provide their employees includes travel expenses for an affected person and one other caregiver to travel outside of state lines to get medical care where it might be needed. And it's expressly they're supporting abortion rights.
Yeah. And I've seen, I think like Starbucks, Dick's Sporting Goods, I've seen a couple of others too. I don't have the list in front of me, but so that's worth Googling for anyone that's interested.
It is.
And write them a nice letter if that's of the kind of thing that you would support. If you don't support it, that's okay. That's okay too. So society is really, really different. And then our own personal energy, when we can invest it in that way. What are some of the ways you see of being helpful? And, if you're living in a place where you're not in agreement with local access and local laws.
I still feel like the most effective thing any individual can do is raise their own consciousness, do self-work. And it's going to feel selfish. It might feel like, well, how if I change myself, how is that going to affect anybody else? That's the biggest way to have a ripple effect, because you see it the other end, right?
Right.
When people are angry and fighting, it doesn't work. You only get more anger and fighting. You're not really changing. But if you can really keep pushing yourself, doing your own self-work, checking yourself every time you get smug.
Right.
Just doing the really hard personal work, your own vibrational, this sounds so woo, but literally your vibration rate's going to go up, and that's going to have a ripple effect of everybody around you in a positive way.
Yeah. And I think that helps us be more effective. That keeps us out of shouting matches. And it helps us have civil conversations with people who are of a very different mind. If all parties are on a higher vibration, we can actually have the conversations that need to be had.
Right. When we're not going to get triggered so easily. Yeah, we can actually listen.
Right. I think the other thing, and I want to, especially for those of like sort of spiritual religious kind of backgrounds, especially those in a Christian tradition, it's actually our job to do justice work. But often we think we have to be the hero or the shero, right? We think we have to solve the problem, but that's actually not the case. Ooh. Right? Like Jesus went person to person. Jesus ministered person to person.
Right.
So you're an agent of justice to the person in front of you.
Yeah.
So like talking to someone civilly is an act of justice.
And listening.
Working to change systems is also an act of justice. But we think sometimes we think we have to like be Moses or we have to be like Martin Luther King Jr. And we don't. Not everyone is called to be such a big agent of change, right? We can do it in really small ways. And those are very honored. Right. In this kind of energetic system that Andrea and I operate in.
Right. And to that end, check wherever state you are. There is probably a women's rights organization there that operates with these values.
Yeah.
That is not about bashing and killing all the white men. Right. it's more about, okay, let's meet our legislature where we are. Let's meet our society. Let's meet people where they are and start working for change in a way that is not based on anger and fear.
Right.
So in South Carolina, we have a wonderful women's right empowerment network. So I would just check your own state because I'm sure there's a women's rights organization that works on a high level and is effective.
Yeah, they're very, very effective, and they know the ins and outs. So you're not alone.
Totally.
You're not alone, right? You're doing this with other people. Would it be helpful for a moment to talk about kind of philosophy of how to interpret the Constitution?
Yeah, actually, because you raised something fascinating. You compared it to interpreting how people interpret the Bible. Yeah, I never thought about that before.
Yeah, so there's different philosophies for interpreting documents. And so sometimes in biblical studies, we'll see, well, we have to get back to what it originally meant, and then that's what we follow. But there's problems with that. One, it's really hard to determine what someone actually meant unless you're like sitting there and you can ask them. And even so, if someone asked me what I wrote down years ago, what I originally meant, I probably couldn't tell them. So that like original intent is a mythic thing to sort of follow. I mean, it's nearly impossible to recapture. Second, often original intent may not so much apply to our lives today. It's, especially with the Bible, we're talking about literally thousands of years of separation of history, culture, and values. So I think it's a worthwhile question. For
Mhm.
me, it's not the determinative question. Like if I can
Correct.
figure out what the
Right.
author of so-and-so meant in the Bible, does that mean I'm obligated to agree with them? No, it means it's really
Right.
curious. I'm
Right.
curious about it. I kind of want to know if I can figure that out. But
Well,
should that inform exactly how I live my life today? That's crazy. God, we also have like common sense and history and a lot of other input since then.
right. And with any legal analysis, whether it's the Constitution or another document, it gets it's where do you stop? So a lot of the justices on the United States Supreme Court today are strict constructionists, meaning they want to take it as it's written very literally. And if it's not spelled out, it's not in there, move on. Now, other people, when they go to that idea of like, well, what does the document say? What did they intend? What did the founders mean? What was going on? They'll go back and actually look at all the arguments that were flying back and forth at the time. So, well, because it was heated debate on
Right.
multiple sides on what was going to end up in this document. So then you have this like, well, they debated this one topic, but it didn't end up in there. So does that mean that topic is not supposed to be in the Constitution because it didn't end up explicitly in there, even though the founders were talking about it? Did they intend it to be implied? Or did they intend to specifically leave it out? You don't have that level of back foundational stuff with the Bible, but it's the same.
Yeah, we don't have the history of the debate.
You don't have the history,
correct.
Right?
But anytime you see a strident kind of statement or law in the Bible, you don't make laws except for when people are doing something you don't want them to do.
Right.
That's why you.
Right.
And so definitely in the law section of the Bible, we can guess, or let's say in 1 Corinthians, right? In 1 Corinthians, Paul cautions the women not to prophesy so much. So that means there were women in there who were prophesying.
Yeah.
And he doesn't like this. I happen to think he's wrong. Right? Like I don't think he got that one right. He got that one wrong. But so we can you can kind of trace back, but not quite with the same historical record.
Right.
That we might have now. So we have this strict
and by the way,
constructionist.
Yeah, there's a lot that our founders got wrong, y'all.
Yeah, of course.
A lot.
Right. Yeah. There's no such thing as a 3/5 of a person. Right. Which was the view of people of color.
A bizarro compromise, right?
Yeah, a super weird compromise. And so there was a lot that they get wrong. So we have this strict constructionist that some of the justices have now, versus others who don't.
Right.
And so the same is true of the Bible. So I think it's probably evident that I'm guessing you are not a strict constructionist, Andrea, and neither would I be of the Bible or of kind of any ancient document or older document, foundational document that we're talking about. Yeah. Well,
society and progress is also a living, breathing thing, and our governing documents need to reflect that.
Yeah, and so we make updates and changes for the times that we're in. Well, I'm just reflecting on the energy, and I want to say this out there for anyone who was feeling a little triggered. When Kavanaugh was appointed, how many years ago? 3 years ago? 2.5, 3 years ago, something like that. I was completely actually his appointment set me on this whole path to explore, to do some more self-work, because it was triggering me so much that I was like, I can't, I couldn't, if someone was having a conversation about it, I had to leave the room.
Yeah.
And I'm still I'm still flabbergasted as to why he and several other male justices are on the Supreme Court. Because I went there, but it seems like they're flagrant abusers. And so, but this triggered me so much that such a person could be placed in this position. And it still does, it angers me now, it doesn't trigger me.
Mm-hmm.
But this set me on a whole path of kind of some energy work, of some exploration. I worked with a therapist around this too, to figure out what some of those core issues were.
Right.
And now it's brought me to this place where I can actually engage in this conversation. I definitely could not have had this conversation with you a couple of years ago. And so even these catalysts, it's not that I want any injury. It's not that I think the injury that was done by this person is of God or anything like that. It was simply the catalyst for me to do my work. So I'm putting out there the invitation, if anyone's feeling really overwhelmed by this could also be the opportunity to take a step back. And it's okay to disengage from the news And it's also the
Oh my gosh.
invitation. Yeah. But
Yeah.
disengaging from it for the next couple of decades is not plausible.
Right.
Right. So we have to find ways to be able
Right.
to engage from a self-protected and a higher vibration way with this. So
Right.
so yeah, if
Finding your own
anyone's
path.
yeah, so if anyone's wanting to know more about that, like the self-work that Andrea mentioned, that I'm mentioning, that's kind of what we help people do.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I will say just my knee-jerk reaction when I get triggered and overwhelmed, I just want to go hide under the bed.
Sure. Yeah. And you can. No one's stopping you. You can just can't stay there.
Right. You can't stay there. That's right. That's not, we weren't here. We're not put here on earth to hide under the bed.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah. So there's all these opportunities for our own growth in the middle of
Definitely.
in the
In the middle
of
of chaos.
in the middle of chaos. Yeah. This up and down energy. So, well, anything I should have asked about, legal
I don't think
analyses that I
so.
haven't asked?
I don't think so. We can do a follow-up if we need to.
Yeah, we'll totally will. All right. So y'all, if you have questions, put them underneath. Questions about law, Andrea, questions about the Bible, me, questions about energy, both of us. So
Yep.
just put them in the comments. We'll get back to them. So thank you so much.
Thank you.